Would you please welcome the Right Honourable John Bercow, 157th Speaker of the House of Commons.
Mary, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. I don't know whether I was giggling, but I was certainly chortling, and I was chortling along with Steve in warm appreciation of what he had to say. It is, of course, friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, a privilege to follow Steve. Can I begin by inquiring whether you can hear me at the back? I'm extremely grateful to you, sir, both for the affirmation that you can and for the moderately eccentric manner in which you have gesticulated at me. Your answer in the affirmative, I must say, represents, particularly the enthusiasm with which it was volunteered, a notable improvement upon the last occasion on which I posed that self-same question to an audience, can you hear me at the back, in which, ladies and gentlemen, some unhelpful wag responded, yes, but I shall happily change places with someone who can't. So the fact you can hear me and don't seem altogether distraught about the fact at this early juncture is a source of modest succour and encouragement to me. The second matter of which I want to treat before I advance further is a sensitive one, which I suspect your natural courtesy will disincline you to raise with me directly, but which, if unaddressed, will lurk from my vantage point perilously in the undergrowth. That is the sensitive matter of height. It is not true, repeat, it is not true, though it wouldn't matter if it were, but it is not true that I am the shortest man ever to be Speaker of the UK House of Commons. Sir John Bercow, Speaker from 1394 to 1398, Sir John Wenlock, Speaker from 1455 to 1456, and Sir Thomas Tresham, Speaker in 1459, are all believed to have been shorter than I am, although I do have to admit that this was true only after all three of them had been beheaded. Indeed, no fewer than 7 of my predecessors met their end on the executioner's block. One was killed in battle, and a further poor unfortunate soul was brutally murdered. So you will understand that this does enable me to view the woes and challenges which afflicted and confronted the House of Commons during my tenure, and which in all candour I readily concede, from time to time afflicted and confronted me, personally, with an appropriate sense of historical perspective. That is to say, whatever else happened to me, I was not likely to lose my head. It's a joy and a privilege to join you to treat of this crucial issue for your industry, but for the country as a whole, of responsible leadership. What does it mean? What does it connote? How do we interpret it? To me, in office as Speaker for just over a decade, responsible leadership meant pursuing necessary, desired, and overdue innovation. Not change or innovation or reform or modernization for the sake of it, but in order to deliver improvements, to make things better. My broad attitude could be encapsulated in that age-old adage, keep the best and improve the rest. And in particular, colleagues, I sought to deliver innovation in 3 ways. First, innovation in the chamber. For a long time, because the government controlled the agenda, the order paper, the business of the day, if there was an urgent matter resulting from a contradiction in government policy, a palpable change of heart, a great embarrassment to ministers, a row about expenditure or personnel appointments, which it was inconvenient for the government of the day to address, it wouldn't volunteer to do so, and the only way it could be addressed in the chamber would be if a member applied for an urgent, capital U, question, capital Q, to the Speaker, and the Speaker granted it. That entitlement understanding orders had fallen into desuetude for years and years and years. And when I sought election as Speaker, I said, if you elect me, I'm going to reintroduce the opportunity for urgent questions, of which there had been but 2 in the previous 12 months, during a period covered by the global financial crisis and a great deal else besides. In the first year, I granted 24. Over 10 years, I granted 685. That simply being the Speaker saying, this is a matter that warrants the attention of the House of Commons and the scrutiny of a government minister who must come and answer whatever else he or she is doing. I was astonished at first when Ed Balls, whom I greatly admired then and continue to admire now, phoned me up on the day there was a UQ in about the appointment of the Children's Commissioner when he was Secretary of State for Children, Schools and Families, and it became apparent that he was doing so, ladies and gentlemen, specifically to lobby me to decline the application. And he seemed, let us say, disappointed, nay, crestfallen, when in the course of a brief but courteous exchange that morning, I said to him, Ed, I'll reflect on it. I think there's a powerful case for it, but I will consider it, and you'll get the answer this afternoon. And he seemed genuinely taken aback by that. And I was subsequently told that it had previously been the norm for ministers to signal a disquiet about or opposition to such a question being granted, whereupon it wouldn't be. Well, I made a point of granting them when I thought the House should be treating of that matter that was being discussed around the dinner tables across the country, in the Dog and Duck, at the ministerial workplace, and in the media, but not in the chamber of the House of Commons. That did, I think, inject some urgency and vibrancy, but it didn't make me very popular, often with government ministers. The 2 who dealt with them best were Jack Straw in the Labour government and Michael Gove under the Conservatives. Sufficiently dexterous, adroit, nimble-footed, intellectually capable that they could hack it. The second change in the chamber was that I presided controversially over the granting of a great number of SO24 debates on matters that I judged were emergencies and for which there was a notable parliamentary appetite. And very specifically, and most controversially of all, attracting huge and coruscating criticism from ministers and parts of the right-wing press, I allowed backbenchers last September, under Standing Order 24, to vote to take control of the agenda with a view to passing a law that would say this country will not leave the European Union without a deal unless there is explicit authorization by Parliament. And the government thought that I was wrong to do that. There was nothing in the standing order to say that I couldn't. I absolutely admit that it was no part of the initial rationale for the introduction of that standing order that it should be used for that purpose. And that led people to say it's unprecedented. And I said, yes, it's unprecedented, but it's not prohibited. And it's unprecedented for me to use it or to allow it to be used. But we are in unprecedented, uncharted times, and it is warranted. But was it popular? It was not popular. And those decisions with government, and those decisions are decisions that you have to take on a lonely basis, withstanding the sound and fury as you do so. The second form of innovation over which I presided was across the parliamentary estate in the Speaker's role as chair of the House of Commons Commission. And I want very briefly to give you 3 examples. When I stood for election as Speaker, we had a shooting gallery in Parliament, but no nursery where MPs and staff could pay to put their children. I decided that we needed a nursery to be paid for with a capital cost, of course, but thereafter by members and staff. No end of objections from traditionalists, from fuddy-duddies, from the reactionaries, from those who uttered the time-honoured objection, it's never been done, Mr. Speaker. Or as somebody said to me, it's a very good idea in principle, Mr. Speaker, but I'm afraid there's no suitable site. There's no suitable site. There's no suitable site. And I said, you're inviting me to accept that across the whole of the Palace of Westminster we can't find a site. I found a site, ladies and gentlemen, the site of Bellamy's Bar. Kew, segueing into a firestorm of ad hominem abuse directed at me because I was depriving researchers of a watering hole. As Tom Watson said at the time, this is a ridiculous objection to the Speaker's much overdue and hugely desirable plan. There's no shortage of places where we can get a beer, but there's nowhere we can put a baby. Babies have to be looked after in the whip's office. Well, come. In terms of the infliction of mental cruelty and potentially permanent personality damage, what could be worse? It's now thriving, and I'm pleased to tell you, the Stock Press News, the nursery is thriving, and the pistol shooting gallery was closed down due to lack of demand. Secondly, I resolved that in one of the oldest and most distinguished parliaments in the world, it was lamentable, nay, almost criminal, that we didn't have an education centre to welcome young people, our future citizens. And I resolved, with the support of colleagues and less criticism, but not none, that we would have a digital, high-tech, cutting-edge, state-of-the-art, interactive facility that would allow us over a period to attract another 100,000 young people to Parliament to learn about the journey from the signing of the Magna Carta to the rights and responsibilities that citizens enjoy today. Who objected? The House of Lords objected because it was going to be situated adjacent to them, as that was the architectural and planning advice that I received. And one of them said, "Mr. Speaker, if I may say so on behalf of my colleagues in the upper house, Parliament is a serious place. It is no place for young children." Now, what does that tell you about some people cocooned in their own self-serving world and environment who think that you can somehow defend democracy and justify leadership by shutting out the very people in whom you would want to inculcate some knowledge of, interest in, and commitment to the democratic legislature of the United Kingdom? But that was the attitude, and I had to fight against the Lords, against the bigot faction in the media. Of course, that absolutely goes without saying, it's predictable as the passage of the seasons, in going with that project. And I remember at one point, the then Clerk and Chief Executive, of whom we've heard more recently, Lord Lisvane, said to me, "Mr. Speaker, the Commons are with you, the Lords are against." And it was a very fair question he put to me. The Commons are with you and the Lords are against. Do you want to put a stop on it, press the pause button and build support in the Lords, or do you want to proceed anyway, authority for which, as the accounting officer of the House, I can happily provide? It's a perfectly legitimate expenditure, but it'll have to be spent by the Commons. The Lords won't contribute. And I said, "Robert, let's get on with it, because if we wait, it might be 10 or 15 or 20 years before anything happens." And I'm proud that we made that facility happen. But did I make enemies in the process? Yes, I made enemies in the process. But I took the view, I've got support in the Commons, it's the right thing to do, let's get on with it. The third example on the parliamentary estate is diversity and inclusion. Nadeem Zahawi, the Minister, rightly focused on that issue in relation to your industry and more widely. When I sought and obtained election as Speaker in June 2009, most of the senior staff positions in the House were occupied by middle-aged, upper-middle-class white men. I thought, this doesn't look like the country we're charged to represent, and I'm absolutely determined to catalyse innovation and change so that we look and feel differently in the future. I did appoint the first female Speaker's chaplain, the Right Reverend Rose Hudson-Wilkin, in the history of the House, and just before I left, the second. I did appoint the first female and BAME Speaker's Council, Sarah Salimi, in the history of the House, and I did appoint both the first and the second BAME Sergeants at Arms in the history of the House. Now, with the early appointments, there was criticism. People were unnerved. And what I found is that people volunteered their views about these matters with a force and critical as well as rhetorical insistence, which, my friends, were in inverse proportion to their knowledge of the subject matter under consideration. They did not feel in any way constrained, still less handicapped, by not knowing the facts. So they weren't on the interview panel, they hadn't seen the CVs, they couldn't speak to the merits of the individual candidates, but they knew this appointment is not right, the Speaker's making a bish of it, and it won't play well. Well, I thought, let's get it done, and then let's embed that innovation, that change, culturally, by bringing into the arsenal of the House a recruitment process guided by specialist diversity recruitment consultants and headhunters that will enable us to ensure that change is not a one-off or totemic appointment, but part of a permanent cultural transformation in the House. The last aspect of innovation that I want to highlight is this. I chaired the UK Youth Parliament, and I made a point of going to schools and colleges and universities and faith groups throughout my time as Speaker. I hosted about 1,000 charitable events in Speaker's House, but in particular, I chaired the QEII's sitting on a non-sitting Friday in the Chamber of the House every year for a decade, as I promised I would, and I went to their conference every year to speak to them and hear questions from them and to engage with them every year for a decade, as I promised I would. I conclude by saying this. When I resolved to chair the QEII, a very senior Conservative member, now retired, florid of face, flecks of spittle being volunteered in my direction, came up to me and said, "Mr. Speaker, it's an absolute disgrace, it will be a disaster." And I said, "Why is that? What makes you say that?" And he said, "At the very least, you mark my words, Mr. Speaker. Sir, I've been here a very great deal longer than you." And I said, "No, I know exactly when you arrived in your North West of England constituency in a by-election in 1971. That's not the issue. The issue is, why will it be a disaster?" And he said, "You mark my words, Mr. Speaker. At the very least, chewing gum will be left all over the chamber. And at the worst, penknives will be used, and damage will be inflicted on these benches, which I love." And I said, "I respect your candour. I do not respect your calumny and vituperation against the young people of the UK Youth Parliament. I predict to you they'll be proud to come, they'll speak well, and they will behave a damn sight better than we do." Ladies and gentlemen, I say not in my support, but in theirs, the young people of the UK Youth Parliament, I was right on all three counts. And my parting shot is to say to you, if you try to innovate, if you try to make a difference, if you try to improve from the status quo, you will court controversy. I had a relationship with the government whips characterised by trust and understanding. I didn't trust them and they didn't understand me. And as Speaker, as with so many other roles, you've got a choice. You can either be a reforming, innovating, change-making, modernising Speaker, making good decisions and making mistakes, but delivering change. You can either be a reforming Speaker or you can be an uncontroversial Speaker, but you can't be both. I made my bed. I have been happy to lie in it, and although I'm flawed as everybody is because to err is human, I'm proud of the fact that I didn't just sit there and act as a nodding donkey or some craven and quiescent lickspittle of the executive branch. I took on the challenges, including standing up to powerful prime ministers, and I'm not embarrassed about that. When Cameron complained that he'd had to overrun 5 minutes because I prolonged Prime Minister's question time, he came out of the chamber and said to me rather abrasively, "Mr. Speaker, I do have a plane to catch, you know." And I said, "Yes, I appreciate that, Prime Minister. But with great respect, it is your plane. It's not going to leave without you. You have nothing, Prime Minister, about which to moan." Now, obviously, my shyness and self-effacement will be well known to you, but I've used the opportunity of this responsible leadership conference in a magnificent advertising industry to try to overcome that natural shyness, reticence, self-effacement, and diffidence, and it's for you to mark me out of 10 as to whether I have made any progress on my journey. Thank you very much indeed. Now, I have spoken to and indeed at you, and notwithstanding your huge courtesy and forbearance, the truth is you'll be relieved beyond words to know that my speech is at an end, but I hope your questions are about to begin, and I shall be gutted. I shall be gutted if you don't have questions. Oh, well, thank you, sir. Very obliging and compassionate intervention on your part. Well, I say that before I've heard the question.
Thank you very much. No, it's a straightforward question. Will the restoration and renewal of the parliamentary estate actually happen this decade?
I think it will happen, the restoration and renewal of the parliamentary estate, but as you will know, the truth of the matter is you don't have to look into the crystal ball when you can read the book. All the evidence is that whether it be government computer contracts or building contracts, things tend to overshoot, both in terms of cost and in terms of time. It is scheduled to get underway in 2025, there being an enormous amount of minutiae and intricate work to be done before the work on restoration renewal starts and before, for example, we can decant. So will it happen to time? I doubt it. Will it happen? I think it will, and I have come to believe, reluctantly, that it will be necessary to decant from Parliament because the sheer scale of the engineering task across both houses is such that the notion that it can be done on a sort of make, do and mend basis, or while we are simultaneously continuing to operate, or my colleagues, my former colleagues, are continuing simultaneously to operate in both houses, is wholly unrealistic. So it will happen, but it will probably happen late, and it will cost you more than you're currently being told. Please, sir. I hope we can have some diversity in this audience. It would be good to have some questions from women or our BAME representatives, particularly those who already asked a brilliant question. They shouldn't feel subdued or quieted in any way. Please.
Simple question. What's your view on the role of political advertising?
Political advertising, I think, can be hugely effective. I've always thought, and I haven't said this to Steve Woodford, or indeed in the past I knew Maurice Archie, but I've always thought for the agencies, thinking of it from your point of view, it's actually quite a risky business because by comparison with, say, consumer advertising, it doesn't pay very well. I don't know whether the political parties pay their bills on time, but it certainly doesn't pay very well. And it's hugely risky in that if the campaign is unsuccessful or the slogan is crawled over by people who have absolutely no capacity to create one but nevertheless disapprove of yours, it can be reputationally harmful to the advertising agency concerned. Can it be effective? Yes. Picking up on what Steve said earlier, let me say unequivocally, get Brexit done was a highly effective slogan. And there was an element, maybe only a scintilla, maybe but a morsel, but there was an element of truth in it, in that if the Conservatives got a majority, as they did, they could get phase 1 of Brexit done. More widely, my friends, it is manifest arrant nonsense to suppose that Brexit will be got done, if I can inelegantly summarise the slogan, simply by withdrawing on the 31st of January. But what Boris Johnson did very effectively, no doubt advised by his Svengali, was to appeal to people suffering Brexit fatigue. And, you know, I spoke at a city dinner, a corporate finance dinner in November, which was pro-capitalist, not that many Labour supporters in the room, but not very Tory either, and very Remainer, heart of London, very Remainer, professional middle-class audience. And going round the tables before I spoke, I met a number of people who were very anti-Brexit and pretty anti-Boris Johnson's government, but they did say to me almost beseechingly, I'm torn because I don't like it, but in business terms, the delay, the stasis, is paralysing and it's got to be resolved. My own view is that, oh, I'm fed up with this. Oh, just get on with it. This is all taking too long. Are entirely understandable human reactions, my friends, but they are not good guides to policy. And okay, you'll say that I've got a vested interest in saying what I'm about to say, but I will say it anyway because I happen to think that it suffers from the disadvantage of not being said very often. So I am going to say it, and it's this. That last Parliament could perfectly well have continued. There is a fashionable view that there had to be an election, and we had to get on with it and break the logjam. We had a Fixed-Term Parliaments Act legislated for by Parliament. The Liberal Democrats and the SNP didn't have to row in with Labour behind the idea of an early election. They chose to do so, and I personally believe that although it wasn't a dishonourable judgment, it was a fatally misconceived judgment. In politics, ask yourself, what does my opponent want? And don't then give it to him or her. What Boris Johnson wanted, what he repeatedly said, I want to bring this matter to an end by having an election. Let's get Brexit done by having an election. It's gone on too long. We've got to have an election. We didn't have to have an election. Those parties resisting it could have collaborated and tried to do things differently. The rest is history. But getting a trade deal with the European Union, getting a trade deal with the United States, these are going to be enormously time-consuming, multifaceted, complex and nuanced matters. As to the Americans, I mean, getting any deal with the Americans is complex because they're legendarily ferocious negotiators. When you're dealing with a president who, well, is not obviously the most stable occupant of the office in the history of the United States, in an election year, you know, it is Panglossian optimism to suppose that he's going to put the British interest before the American interest, and the idea that he would put any interest before his own is off the scale barking. Who else? Please. The woman there. Thank you. Thank you.
If you had another 10 years ahead of you to change things further, what would be the main things you think need to change with our parliamentary culture and processes?
I happen to think myself there is a growing case for electoral reform, but that wouldn't have been something that I could do as Speaker. Within the House, I have to give you rather sort of dull procedural answers, but they speak to my experience. I think that the way we treat private members' bills is extremely immature, allowing them to be talked out by people almost reading lists of names of telephone directories. And I think it would be much better to give them an allocated time and deal with them properly. I think there should be a trigger mechanism for the recall of Parliament during recesses, which doesn't depend on the government asking me, but which can come from the grassroots democratically, a cross-party third of the House, say, saying there's an urgent national crisis. The government might not want to recall and face scrutiny, but we should. I think there should be a possibility for MPs to recall Parliament without the Prime Minister's agreement. That isn't possible at the moment. I've been arguing this for years, but unfortunately it's not being gripped as an issue. And I think we should have a House Business Committee, so all government business has to be timetabled and scheduled by a cross-party committee on which the government would have a majority, but the government shouldn't be able to call the shots. In our system, government is too powerful and non-government parties are too powerless. I tried simply to facilitate the House of Commons to do what it wanted to do. And I must just emphasise that as far as I was concerned, like, for example, when I selected an amendment that the government didn't think I should have selected, I said to the government chief whip, Julian, it's not my responsibility to protect you from the absence of a government majority in the House. I wasn't trying to stop Brexit, as my more bigoted Neanderthal critics say. I admit I think Brexit is a colossal foreign policy blunder, the biggest in the post-war period. But I wasn't trying to stop it, and I wasn't trying to facilitate it. What I was trying to do was to facilitate the House of Commons unhindered and freely, as a parliament should, to do what it wanted to do. And my attitude was that the government shouldn't use either wrong precedent or procedural chicanery to stop the House of Commons having its say and having its way. That's going to be much more difficult in this Parliament because of the humongous majority. I'll take one more, if I'm allowed. Well, Mary's one.
Yeah,
okay.
so It is a simple question, and it's more about you. You touched on the loneliness of your position. You're effectively a referee in the middle of a pitch. It is a very lonely role. Where do you go to when, I mean, you're clearly quite confident, self-assured individual, but occasionally it's going to get a bit too much. What's the go-to for you? What's the support? And is there a little community of previous speakers that you can go and have sanctuary with?
Thank you. You need to take responsibility, but you also need allies. And what I had, ladies and gentlemen, was a little group of people from across the House. On the Conservative side, Julian Lewis and Charles Walker, and on the Labour side, a core group of people. Rosie Winterton, Harriet Harman, were two very, very good examples. Alison McGovern, who's a Labour MP in the Wirral. These were my sort of absolutely core group. Tasmina Ahmed Sheikh and Joanna Cherry within the SNP. I'd had about half a dozen people I consulted and one advisor from outside Parliament. The one time that I found quite painful, I admit, was when my wife left me in 2015, and fortunately for me, she came back. But she left me for a period because she was miserable living in Parliament and so on. And my dear friend Charles Walker came up to me in the chair and he said, "John, I feel for you, mate." He said, "I don't know how you can bear to keep going because you must be upset about your personal situation and so on." And I said, "Well, the question of not keeping going just doesn't arise, Charles. The way I deal with it is I compartmentalise. I'm not going to put a paper bag over my head. I've not done anything wrong. I'm just going to keep buggering on. Focus, 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 do what I think is right. And as to the sort of sound and fury from the bigot faction in the media and so on, it's tomorrow's fish and chip paper. It doesn't matter a jot. Or people sneering at me or teasing me or ridiculing me or abusing me. It doesn't matter. It's probably even good for the soul. I will just focus and get on with it. And I conclude by saying thank you. Good luck for the rest of your conference. And I think, on the whole, I've been very lucky. So I'm not complaining. I had 10 wonderful years as Speaker and 22 years in Parliament. By comparison with a lot of people, I've been very fortunate.